There are 7 people I have never and will never forgive. Not just for one thing, but for a long chain of betrayals. They know exactly who they are, and so do I.
George Harrison.
George Harrison, the quiet Beatle. Fans remember his calm, spiritual presence, but behind those soft eyes was a sharp memory of people he couldn't stand. Some were mocked for their voices, others for using spirituality as a gimmick, and one, a childhood idol who shattered George's admiration the moment they met. Born in Liverpool in 1943, Harrison grew up working class, left school at 16, and soon joined the band that would change history, the Beatles. His reserved manner earned him the nickname, the Quiet Beatle. But quiet didn't mean passive. He clashed with bandmates, resented being sidelined as a songwriter, and carried grudges that lasted decades. Take Elvis Presley. As a teenager, Harrison was electrified the first time he heard Heartbreak Hotel. Elvis was raw rebellion, George's hero, but when they finally met in the 70s, the magic was gone. Instead of the rebel, Elvis was in a glittering jumpsuit, drowned in backup singers and Vegas glitz. George sighed. I just wanted to tell him, put on jeans, grab a guitar, and play like you used to. When Elvis heard that, he reportedly smirked and said, if he thinks I'm going back to bars, he doesn't know a thing about Elvis Presley. From that moment, the idol was gone, replaced by disappointment and distance. For Elvis, George's critique was an insult, coming from a young English kid while he was still king of the Vegas stage. But Elvis wasn't the only blow to Harrison's ideals. Inside the Beatles, a brother became a rival. Paul McCartney was once George's closest ally, the older big brother who shared bus rides, guitars, and endless practice sessions. But as Beatlemania grew, so did Paul's dominance. By Sgt. Pepper in 1967, McCartney's creative stamp was everywhere, leaving George fighting for scraps of space. By the Abbey Road sessions in 1969, Harrison had had enough. He fought Paul's control fiercely, clashing over song arrangements. Even McCartney admitted later, the trouble is, I always thought our songs were better than George's, but now his are at least as good as ours. George wasn't diplomatic. I'd rather have Willie Weeks play bass than Paul McCartney. Paul's brilliant, but too overpowering. I'd join a band with John Lennon any day. Not Paul. It's not personal. It's about direction. By 1974, George's frustrations with Paul boiled over. In a BBC interview, he snapped, Paul has ruined me as a guitar player. And yet, even through the fights, George admitted there was still something unbreakable between them. No matter what we've been through, there's always something that ties us together. But while the bond with Paul was strained, his relationship with John Lennon turned bitter. Before the Beatles became legends, George had idolized Lennon's sharp wit and creativity, but admiration soon gave way to resentment. Lennon's towering presence often left George sidelined, his songs brushed aside with a shrug. Once, after George shared a new demo, John coolly dismissed it. It's fine, but it's not something I'd listen to. As the years went on, Lennon began mocking George's spiritual path, cutting him off in the studio with lines like, don't start telling me about those Indian saints again. What had once been friendship became cold distance. Later, George admitted Lennon could be selfish and difficult. In his memoir, I, Me, Mine, he nearly erased John entirely. When asked why, he gave a quiet smile. Some things don't need to be mentioned. Even after Lennon's tragic death, George refused to rewrite history or hide the scars. And those sharp edges weren't reserved for his Beatles brothers. In 1992, during a chat with Bob Geldof, George revealed a brutally honest side when Neil Young's name came up. I'm not a Neil Young fan. I hate it. I can't stand his voice. Worse than mine, he even mocked Young's guitar solos right there in the studio, calling them laughable. That same year, fate put both men on stage together at Bob Dylan's 30th anniversary concert. The tension was unmistakable. George kept his distance, avoiding more than a glance. Neil, fully aware of George's biting words, chose grace instead. In front of the cameras, he smiled and said, "The Beatles changed everything. I'll always be grateful." When Neil Young was asked about George Harrison's harsh remarks, he simply shrugged. Everyone's entitled to an opinion. I didn't like certain artists when I first heard them either, but time changes how you see things. And when the two finally stood side by side on stage at Dylan's 30th anniversary concert, Neil smiled warmly, singing as if he'd never heard a single word of George's criticism. Harrison, for his part, didn't go out of his way to be friendly, but he didn't cause trouble either. They performed for the audience. Still, everyone sensed the gap between them, but George's clashes weren't always about someone's voice or music. Sometimes for him, it cut much deeper, because in his eyes, certain people were false prophets. During the height of the counterculture, when peace and spirituality were the language of the times, George Harrison had one unwavering principle: never compromise with what he saw as falsehood. For him, music and spirituality weren't separate paths. They had to walk hand in hand and with complete sincerity. That's why Pete Townshend, the legendary guitarist of The Who, became a target of George's suspicion. Townshend had built a reputation as a rock visionary. His windmill guitar swings, the raw power of The Who, and his use of spiritual themes in their rock opera, Tommy. He often spoke about the teachings of Meher Baba, preaching peace, compassion, and enlightenment. But Harrison didn't buy it. In a 1966 interview with India Today, George took aim directly. Townshend, "Yeah, every time I've met him, he's been stoned, talking rubbish. I don't think he's serious about all that religion stuff." To George, Townshend's spirituality was nothing but a performance, a costume for the crowd. And that, in his eyes, wasn't just shallow. It was a betrayal of both art and faith. The bitterness may have run deeper than philosophy. Behind the scenes, Pete Townshend had reportedly helped Eric Clapton pursue Pattie Boyd, George's wife at the time, and the inspiration for Clapton's haunting love song Layla. George never publicly condemned Townshend for it, but the shadow of that betrayal couldn't have been easy to ignore. This wasn't just rivalry over who played the better guitar or who had more fame. It was a collision between the sacred and the superficial, truth versus pretense. And in a world of flashing stage lights and roaring crowds, George Harrison clung to purity, refusing to stay silent, even if it meant standing against rock's biggest icons. And when Britpop took over the charts in the 90s, Harrison crossed paths with a new phenomenon. But instead of being impressed, he saw nothing but noise, swagger, and excess baggage. Enter Liam Gallagher. During the Britpop explosion of the 1990s, Oasis were hailed as the heirs to the Beatles. For fans, it felt like history repeating itself, a symbolic handoff from one generation of legends to the next. But George Harrison wasn't buying it. In 1996, speaking with Independent Radio News, he dismissed Liam Gallagher, Oasis's brash frontman, with a cold shrug. "He seems a bit out of date and rather silly. I think it's been proven. When you see the band without him holding a microphone, he's just excess baggage." It wasn't just a jab at Liam. It was Harrison's way of cutting down the entire Britpop frenzy. A year later in France, he sharpened it even further. "They're not very interesting." For Liam Gallagher, that was like waving a red flag. On MTV News, he shot back with a sneer. "I still love the Beatles, but Harrison? He's a clown. A proper clown. If I saw him, I'd tell him straight." He even twisted the knife, accusing George of being the one out of touch. "He just reads the papers." That public back and forth made the gap between the Beatles era and the Britpop generation painfully clear. Instead of a historic handshake between icons, fans got a war of words: loud, messy, unforgettable. But not all of Harrison's feuds were about swagger and egos. Some were more complicated, rooted in disappointment and shadowed by addiction. On the surface, George Harrison and Elton John seemed close. They shared stages, parties, and plenty of photos smiling side by side. But behind the flashes of the cameras, their relationship was far more bitter. In 1976, George shocked interviewers with his bluntness. "Elton John's music? I've never thought much of it. Every song sounds the same. He wrote one good song years ago, but the rest is just a formula. 4 chords, some lyrics, shake it up, and there's another Elton mega hit." That wasn't just criticism. It was a blade straight to the heart of one of the biggest artists in the world. Yet Elton never retaliated. In fact, he later praised George as the wise man of the Beatles, someone who had found a deeper treasure than fame. And in his memoir, Elton revealed a moment that explained why. At a party surrounded by drinks and laughter, George looked him straight in the eye and said, "For God's sake, cut down on that marching powder." Everyone else stayed silent. George was the only one willing to tell him the truth. Not as a rival, not as a rock star, but as a friend. That was George Harrison, cold yet caring, distant yet honest. A man who could slice your ego in half but still reach out when it mattered most. His story wasn't about perfection, but about integrity, about refusing to live in pretense, even in the dazzling, deceptive world of rock and roll. And maybe that's the greatest lesson he left behind. Sincerity is worth more than glory.